And welcome back to the last part of the research methodology that we'll be talking about different types of collecting primary data. Today we're going to be looking at primary data using questionnaires, something that I actually used on my last thesis. So the idea is that you're going to question people, hopefully the people that are appropriate. We have to be very careful even before we actually start designing the questionnaires is what we sort of expect out of it, who we're going to be dealing with, and some of the problems that can be anticipated, let's say, before we start. So let's get and have a look at these. So the definition of a questionnaire, first of all, techniques of data collection in which each person is asked to respond to the same set of questions in a predetermined order. The idea being that everybody gets the same thing and there shouldn't be any variations between them. So when to use them? For explanatory or descriptive research. Usually it's linked with other methods of multiple method research design, and obviously almost always with secondary research. To collect responses from a large sample prior to quantitative analysis, which we'll be talking about in another session. Having said that, while we touch on this at the moment, the actual sample size that we're talking of, a lot depends on the actual kind of questionnaires that you're giving. It depends on the audience of those that are going to be using them. In other words, if you're talking about companies in a certain industry in a certain country and you're talking to all the CEOs of those companies, or the majority, say 50, that is a huge amount and obviously covers a large percentage of that particular sample population. Whereas if we're talking about the general public, again, we would need huge numbers to get a general cross-section. And this has been done in the past at great cost by doing it wrong. A good example of this was Coca-Cola, which you would think they would know about these things. They did a marketing research program about introducing new Coke some years ago, back in the 1980s. And the results came in from issuing thousands of questionnaires, and it seemed that people preferred the new Coke. Unfortunately, what happened was, despite having a very large sample, it was restricted to only certain states, predominantly those in the southern states in the USA. And when they based the results of that limited sample and decided to go with the new Coke, they found that the market in general, globally, or certainly nationwide, was not in agreement with it. So again, we have to be very careful of the amount of the sample and how we're getting it a broad-based sample as possible, and also the most appropriate to what we're actually trying to achieve. So some types of questionnaires, the self-administered ones, ones which generally are a lot easier to do, usually sent by internet or post, those that are still doing that, and the delivering collection of the questionnaires. The others are the interviewer administered ones, where they usually done via telephone or in a structured interview. So types of questionnaires. The design of a questionnaire differs according to how it's administered, and in particular the amount of contact you had with respondents. Self-administered questionnaires are usually completed by the respondents. Such questionnaires are administered electronically using internet or intranet, or posted, who return them after completion, or delivered by hand. When I was doing mine, I used the students, so obviously I had access to all their emails, so I sent all my students, all 600 of them, my questionnaire. And also, because it came from the actual university, it gave them, let's say, a little bit more incentive to respond, because this again can be the problem, which we'll look at later, about how many people are actually going to respond to your questionnaires. So responses to interviewer administered questionnaires are recorded by the interviewer and on the basis of each respondent's answers. Questionnaires administered using telephone, surprisingly enough, are known as telephone questionnaires. The final category, structured interviews or interview schedules, refer to those questionnaires where interviewers physically meet respondents and ask them the questions face to face. So they differ from semi-structured and unstructured interviews, as there are a definite schedule of questions from which interviews should not deviate. In other words, it's not based on any of the answers that somebody should give. You're asking a specific question, looking for a specific answer, rather than maybe asking them to elaborate on a particular thing, which wouldn't happen if you had done this via the internet. You wouldn't have the opportunity to ask additional questions. And obviously this is why we need continuity of this. So again, it can be done with a mixture of both, of actually doing the interview administered one, but they have to be the same questions, same order as those done online. So some related factors. The characteristics of the respondents and access, actually being able to get to them. And as I mentioned, because I did a work that was based on education and needed the respondents to be current students, I was able to get access to all my students. And obviously it was the characteristics, they were the ideal people. They were students that were in the particular situation that I needed to ask them about. So the respondents' answers not being contaminated or distorted. In other words, they could misinterpret or write the answers wrongly. The size of the sample, well, we've touched on that, how big a sample is required. Again, it does depend on the situation, but generally speaking, the larger the better. The type and number of questions required, also to be considered, especially if you're doing the ones that were sent out via email. People maybe get bored if there's 150 questions and are unlikely to complete it. But if it's based on 20 questions, is that enough information to get out of people? You have to have a balance between bothering the respondent too much and actually getting the information that you require. And the available resources, including use of software, which we'll also be looking at later. So some of the key factors of this are precisely defined question, representative and accurate sampling, in other words, getting the right representative of people that you would need to answer the questions, an understanding of the organizational context, and the relationship between the variables, dependent, independent, or extraneous, and the types of variable. So some data requirements that we would have here: investigative questions, variables required, and the detail in which the data is measured, and then the check the measurement questions included in the questionnaire. So some stages must occur if a question is to be valid and reliable. That the researcher, for a start, is clear about the data required and designs a question based on that, on achieving that particular requirement. The respondent decodes the question in the way the researcher intends. Decode, we mean actually understands it in the concept that it's required. So the respondent then answers the question, and then the research decodes the answer in the way the respondents intended. So again, that we understand their particular question. Obviously, when something is very restrictive, a yes or no, then there's not usually much problem with that. However, it can be, if it's to describe something, how much detail do you want people to go into? So designing the questionnaire, assessing validity. Well, the internal validity, if it's valid to them, the content, how valid is the content, the criteria related, in other words, predicted, is it what you're expecting to get, and the actual construct of the question, of how it's intended and understood by the person. So testing for reliability, the three-stage process. Well, test and then retest. Make sure that there is internal consistency and maybe look for alternative forms. So an example of open questions. Now, obviously the advantage of this is we can get answers that maybe we weren't expecting. However, here we have, please list up to 3 things you like about your job. The problem is when we come to tabulate the results afterwards, although each individual only puts 3 particular things they like about the job, maybe it's one person would put, well, I like parking, I like my office, and I like the cafeteria. And another would say, I like the receptionist, the holidays, and the salary. Now it leaves us open to having a multitude of answers that are very difficult to tabulate. Asking 100 people for 3 items could result in 300 different answers. So list questions, much easier. What is your religion? Here is an example. So people are one or the other, or in the case of some, like myself, none. So it's quite easy. We have the facility there that we don't need to categorize ourselves in either of these. We can say we're either other or none. So make sure you have that. Not necessarily everybody fits into a particular thing. Category questions. So here's an example. How often do you visit a shopping centre? So you listen to the answer if you're asking them or you ask them on the internet. It's their first visit. They go once a week, less than a fortnight, twice a week, or less often. Ranking, how you put them in order of priority. So here in this particular example, we're asking number each of the factors listed below in order of importance to you in choosing a new car. Is it the emissions or the size of the boot or trunk, as the Americans would say? The depreciation, how much it would depreciate over a period, or the actual price that you would have to pay for it. If none of those are important, then leave those as being completely blank. A rating question. So how much do we agree or disagree with a particular view? So here the question is, I feel employees' views have influenced the decision taken by management. I agree with that wholeheartedly, or, well, more or less, or slightly not really, or totally disagree. So we have an option for that. Quantity, something very specific. So here, what is your year of birth? This is a bit presumptive that we've put 19. Certainly for old geezers like me, that would be fine. But I now have students, albeit undergraduate students, who were born in the 2000s. So we might have to change that. In other words, we would put, depending on this, if we were asking about master's students, we might be okay. But otherwise, we would have to leave all four spaces blank for them to put 1995 or 2003. Other considerations. Adopting or adapting existing questions. So remember to check copyright. Maybe something is mentioned in there that we can't use. The question wording, how it's actually worded. Maybe translating the questions into other languages. Do things mean the same thing in other languages? We have to be careful of that. And question coding. Coding basically means that we're putting a number on the responses so that we can actually tabulate them afterwards. So to construct the question again, main considerations, order and flow of the questions, and the questionnaire layout. Maybe something a little bit softer to get started with, and maybe something a little bit stronger as they get into it, or maybe something a bit more controversial, maybe leave until the last, to avoid sort of pissing people off at the beginning. So some key points here. The covering letter, usually it's sending the letter that goes with the questionnaire. In other words, why you should do it, why it's important to complete the questionnaire. Introducing and closing the questionnaire. So here are the questions we would expect so much time to be taken on this. Please answer them carefully, read them, etc. Give them the instructions what we're hoping that they're going to do. And then, of course, at the end, thank them for it. Once it's submitted online, usually we send an autoresponder thanking them for the time that they've spent to answer our questionnaire. Do some pilot testing and assessing validity. So instead of directly going out and asking 20,000 people, maybe just test on a few people and see if you're getting some idea of the kind of responses that you're expecting, or maybe you discover you have to redesign some of the questions. Other points to consider: internet mediated responses. How many are actually sending out? Who, where, how are you getting these people? How likely are they to respond? If there isn't a particular incentive for them to respond, the response rate would probably be incredibly low. Postal questionnaires, again, very expensive to do. Delivery and collection, how you're actually going about this, where they would submit the responses, even if it's on the internet. Telephone questionnaires and structured interviews. So, how, when, where, who with, and how are you going to do them? So generally, to summarise the things that we've been talking about with questionnaires, questionnaires are often used to collect descriptive and explanatory data. There are 5 main types of questionnaire: internet or internet mediated, postal, delivery and collection, telephone and interview schedule. Precise data that meet the research objectives can be produced by using a data requirement table. Data validity and reliability and response rate depends on design, structure and rigorous pilot testing. Wording and order of the questions and question types are also important considerations. And closed questions should be pre-coded to facilitate data input and analysis. Important design features are a clear layout, a logical order and flow of questions, and easily completed responses. The KISS formula. K-I-S-S, keep it simple, stupid. Don't complicate life for them. Questionnaires should be carefully introduced and pilot tested prior to administration. test it first before you run the full version of it. And administration is to be appropriate to the type of questionnaire. And that is all we have on this. So we've covered, over the past few slides, we've covered, and the last couple of presentations, the main types of collecting primary data. We shall now be looking about how you go about analysing this and tabulating it. So talk to you soon in the next class. Thank you very much.